And so it was with me, brothers and sisters. When I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. God's wisdom revealed by the Spirit. We do, however, speak a message of wisdom among the mature, but not the wisdom of this age, or of the rulers of this age, who are coming to nothing. No, we declare God's wisdom, a mystery that has been hidden and that God destined for our glory before time began. None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. However, as it is written, what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, and what no human mind has conceived, the things God has prepared for those who love him. These are the things God has revealed to us by his Spirit. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. For who knows a person's thoughts except their own spirit within them? In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. What we have received is not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, so that we may understand what God has freely given us. This is what we speak, not in the words taught us by human wisdom, but in the words taught by the Spirit, explaining spiritual realities with Spirit-taught words. The person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolishness and cannot understand them because they are discerned only through the Spirit. The person with the Spirit makes judgments about all things, but such a person is not subject to merely human judgment. For who has known the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ.
Thank you, Bob. Feel free to pick up a Bible from the side if you want to follow along. We're particularly looking at 2 Corinthians. I'm going to pull out quite a number of verses from that book, but along with a few others. But I want to ask you a question to start with. What do you think is special about Baptists? I'm sure some of you have had that experience where they say, if you'll get into a conversation about church and, what you did on Sunday, and someone says, what did you do? And I said, yes, I was at church. And they say, what church do you go to? And say, Caversham Baptist Church. And I'm sure from time to time the conversation gets on to, well, what is it? What's a Baptist church then? So, we all know there are various flavours of different churches with different denominations, but what do you think is special about Baptists? Now, in some sense, the easy answer is there's a clue in the title, right? One of the things that is special about Baptists is we believe in the full immersion baptism. You may be aware there's a pool under here, which from time to time we fill up and we baptise some people. We'd always like to do it more often, so if that's something that's on your mind, then do let us know, and we'll be delighted to baptise anyone. But one of the things that's important about our exercise of baptism is that we believe we baptise those who believe. We talk about believers' baptism, so we don't baptise infants as practiced in some other churches, but we practice baptism. So, point one of what's special about Baptists. But we're not the only church denomination that does that, actually. There are other denominations that will practice believers' baptism and full immersion baptism. It's quite common among Pentecostals as well, and various others. Number 2 on my list is from one of the readings that we heard earlier, the priesthood of all believers in 1 Peter 2. Baptists very much believe that we as the gathered church, the members of the church, are all the priesthood. There is no hierarchy in God's economy. All of us are priests, meaning that we all can commune with God. The traditional Old Testament priest was a mediary, an intermediary between the people and God. And it's our belief as Baptists that no such intermediary is now necessary. In a sense, it's an important thing to remember while we are in pastoral vacancy. We don't need a minister to tell us what God is saying. We can all engage with God directly ourselves. It's an important and fundamental point. And many other Christians would believe this as well, but it is an important part of the Baptist flavour. And the third thing, that is distinctive about Baptists, is the phrase used is the liberty of the local church. So each Baptist church is an independent entity. Some of you may understand this. We're an independently governed church, and we work together with other Baptist churches. Indeed, we work together with other churches, but that's at our liberty to do so. We are not obliged to conform to anyone else. In fact, often Baptists, along with some other denominations, are grouped together as non-conformists. You might hear that phrase from time to time, but it's the liberty of the local church. We are locally governed by ourselves as a church come together. And what that results in order to make that work, is we have church meetings. Again, not something totally unique to Baptists. None of these 3 points are individually unique, but the combination of them is what distinguishes Baptists. So believers' baptism, the priesthood of all believers, and the liberty of the local church. And what I'd like to talk a bit more about this morning is how we discern together. What should our church meetings look like? How do we exercise that liberty as a local church in the right way? Ultimately, our church meetings, they are an important gathering for us as a fellowship. We gather to share, we gather to encourage each other. But the primary purpose in the end of our church meetings is actually to discern God's will for our church. What is it that he wishes us to focus on? What is it he wishes us to do? We've got to have the right sorts of things that we're discerning. Perhaps it's less important that we discern the colour of the carpet, the choice of the type of porcelain that we have in the bathrooms, or the colour of the tiles. These maybe are not points that we spend a lot of time discerning, but discerning things like what is our focus area, what sort of minister are we looking for, what other staff, what initiatives, etc. are we as a church going to prioritise? That is the purpose of our church meeting, is to discern those big, important spiritual ministry things that we are going to do together. And it's important, my first point is it's important that it's God's will, not our will. 1 Corinthians 2 talks all about wisdom coming from God through the Spirit. And that is what we're looking for in our church meetings. It's not a political meeting. It's not a gathering of the Conservative or whatever your favourite political party club might be to determine policy or to take a vote on each exact item or discern policy statements or political intentions, we're not actually trying to win an argument. Our church meeting should be about listening to God through prayer, hearing the words of the Spirit. It's not always easy, and it's not to say that we all come with the same opinions. In fact, the book of 2 Corinthians is written to a church in a certain degree of dispute and disunity. And Paul, in writing to them, emphasises in chapter 2 particularly that they need to focus on hearing from God, hearing from the Spirit, because that is the way to unity. But that's not to say that we don't hear different things from God. In fact, sometimes it feels like we hear contradictory things from God, no matter how much we try. Hearing from God is a difficult thing. And not everything that we hear comes clearly from God. It's the exercise of the church meeting together corporately that we discern. It's important actually that we test what people say, that we listen corporately together and hear whether we believe that that is a message for our church. If we just, if we go to 1 John 4, verse 1, which I think we can have on the screen. It says, "Dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world." It's in a section about hearing from God through the Spirit, and I think even an honestly held conviction that God has said something to me can be a deception. It's not to say that people are not trying to hear from God. Sometimes we don't quite hear the right thing. Other messages interfere. We can have a long debate about what you think in terms of the spiritual realm about opposing forces, but the Bible talks fairly clearly about there being opposing forces in the spiritual realm, and it may be sometimes that the evil one places words into our ear that we think are from God but are not. That's why corporately we come together and we test. 1 Corinthians 14, 29 and 30 is talking about how churches should sort of operate in their meetings, and it says, verse 29, it says, 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the others should weigh carefully what is said. If a revelation comes to someone who is sitting down, the first speaker should stop, for you can all prophesy in turn, so that everyone may be instructed and encouraged. I think again, there's sort of a priesthood of all believers. Everyone can bring the prophecy, but what is said needs to be weighed and tested and considered. Our aim ultimately as a church is to discern God's will, and usually, I believe, when God's will is coming to us, we actually come to consensus. God brings us to consensus around what he wants to us, but it can be a slow process. It requires patience and time. So, God's will, not our will. My second point, and I've almost made this point already, is it's important we remember we are the priesthood of all believers. As we heard earlier in 1 Peter, I'm just going to flick 1 Peter 2:9, which I think again we can have on the screen. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Fantastic verse, and you could preach a whole sermon series, I think, just on that one verse. But I think it's important to think to hear that it talks about you are all a chosen people. You are all a royal priesthood. We are all priests in the kingdom of God if we are believers. It doesn't say, I've only spoken to a special select group of leaders. I've only spoken to I'm only speaking through some of you. We are all priests. We can all hear from God if we're listening carefully. All of us can be the intermediary between the church and God. And it's important, therefore, that everybody has the opportunity to speak. Doesn't mean that everybody has to speak, because, if you don't feel God has spoken a word through you, then perfectly right to keep quiet in the church meeting. If everybody had to have their 5 minutes, we could be here a while. But if you feel God has laid something on your heart, it's actually your obligation to bring that to the meeting. Sometimes wisdom can come in a church meeting from a surprising source. We all know there are some people who maybe are more likely to speak than others. I probably fall into that category myself, but that doesn't mean that what I have to say or those who speak most frequently are actually those we need to listen the most to. Sometimes it's the quiet person who just says a wise word from God at the right moment that is the one we really need to remember. Indeed, it's important, actually, that even if we're not sure that God has spoken to us, that we offer it. When we talked about testing, surely the whole point of testing is that sometimes some of us might speak something that isn't what God has for us. Because if everything that was spoken was from God, there would be no testing needed, would there? Sometimes it's right to say, I think God is saying this, but I'm not totally sure. And let the church meeting as a group decide. Sometimes somebody else will say, that's exactly what I was thinking too. I think God is saying that. Or sometimes we have to have the lack of pride to be able to say, well, actually, no, I don't think that is quite what God was saying, but that's okay. If we put it forward and put it out there, then we have the opportunity to discern together. Again, I think this can be a slow process. It can take time and patience with each other. So, point 1, we're looking for God's will. We're trying to discern God's will for our church, not our will. Point 2, we're trying to honour the priesthood of all believers, of all of our members. And then finally, we need to be able to handle disagreement with humility and love. The Corinthian church was very much a divided church. It really was a church that had issues. There were divisions. It talks about, some of them said, well, I'm in the sort of Paul crowd, I'm in the Apollos crowd, depending on who was their preferred speaker, who spoke most clearly to them. There were all sorts of people who were pushing their opinions, and there were strong opinions in the church. So we have to be careful, and this is a good book to read through. Do if you've got time, read it all the way through. But there are some passages in here that I think really spoke to me when I was considering this message. I think it's really important that we come to the church meeting with humility. 1 Corinthians 3:18 to 20 says, "Do not deceive yourselves. If any of you think you are wise by standards of this age, you should become fools so that you may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. As it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows that the thoughts of the wise are futile." Part of the message of 1 Corinthians, particularly if you go back to chapter 1, it makes clear that the world's wisdom is foolishness to God, and God's wisdom is not that of the earth. So we have to lay aside our worldly thoughts and try to focus on what God wants. Doesn't mean we can't bring expertise that we come from elsewhere. I think all our skills and talents are from God. You know, if you've got expertise in particular things, I don't think you should forget it. You know, so you know when we do building work, we don't ignore structural engineers or those who have wisdom in building. But we have to remember that God's wisdom stands above it, particularly when it comes to spiritual matters. It's important that we are listening for what God wants. And there's actually one passage in 1 Corinthians which, to say, is written into a whole section about how the church should operate together. But it's actually the passage that, if you've ever been to a wedding, you've almost certainly heard this passage. Because ultimately, I think as a church, we don't just have to approach the church meeting with humility. We have to approach it with love for one another. 1 Corinthians 13, I'm sure you've all heard it before, but I'm going to read it to you. But I want you to hear it in the context of a divided church, because this is the passage it was actually, if you actually read the chapters before and after, this is what it's actually about. It's not about marriages, although it's always used at pretty... I can barely think of a wedding I've gone to where this passage is not read. But it isn't actually about weddings, it's about churches. 1 Corinthians 13. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and I have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I am nothing. Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. If we enter into our church meetings in a spirit of love, with the underpinning desire for the best for our fellow members, then all the rest will sort itself out. Talked about people prophesying, people speaking in tongues, people having knowledge and discernment of mysteries, but it's all pointless if you don't have love. I think in some ways what this is saying is it's not just important to be right, but it's important to be right in the right way, in a loving and humble way. The second half of 1 Corinthians 13, actually probably less quoted in weddings, but it talks about this concept in verses sort of 8 to 12 about we only have partial understanding. That verse 9, we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when completeness comes, essentially at the end of the age, that is, then what is in part disappears. So essentially saying that we don't fully understand, we can't fully know God's mind. Our discernment is inevitably imperfect. So we need to be humble in that sense. So acknowledge that any wisdom that we're bringing to our church meeting might well be only part of the story and imperfect. So, what do I say in conclusion? Church meetings are key to our life as a Baptist church. It's really important that we come together. It is the fundamental underpinning of our horrible word, but churchmanship, about how Baptists have been from the very beginning, actually. Baptist church meetings have been happening for over 400 years. In many ways, it's more fundamental to being a Baptist than being dunked in water or anything else, is actually this coming together and working together as the priesthood of believers, as the gathered believers in one place to discern God's will for our local church. We should all come together seeking God, seeking God's will. We should all be ready to contribute if God speaks through us. And we need humility and love as we do it. And finally, I think we need to acknowledge that Baptist discernment can be a slow process. It requires patience. Often, big decisions don't get made in one meeting. It takes several meetings for us to come together and discern. It requires patience. In fact, if you want to think more about church meetings, there's actually very recently a Baptist minister called Dr. Ruth Moriarty has published her PhD thesis on Baptist church meetings. I've met Ruth, and she's a minister of a church in London, and her thesis, I think very appropriately entitled on Baptist church meetings, is entitled Slow Wisdom. And I don't think that's a bad epithet for Baptist church meetings. Hopefully we do come to wisdom, but it often requires patience, because often we get there a little bit slowly. But I think we get there in God's time. In fact, if you want to go further into it, there's actually a series of YouTube videos explaining Ruth's thesis, and there's a book you can buy on Amazon if you'd like. So please do. She's actually very good. I think if you go to baptist.org.uk/slowwisdom, there's a whole series of videos on there that she's done in partnership with the Baptist Union, and it was a helpful contributor to this, to what I've said this morning. I did work through it myself. So I do want to acknowledge Ruth's input to this sermon this morning.